Welcome back, gang, and this is part 2 of our Chapter 22 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Home Front. The focus question for this section is, how did the United States mobilize economic resources and promote popular support for the war effort? Military service during World War II threw together a diverse group of Americans from all walks of life. By the time of war's end, approximately 10 million Americans had served in the military, either in Europe or in the Pacific. The draft was reinstated during World War II, and this ensured that wartime sacrifice was widely shared throughout American society. And much like during World War I, the federal government interposed itself in the redirection of the American economy and established new federal agencies to oversee the direction of the economy for war production. This included the War Production Board, the War Manpower Commission, and the Office of Price Administration. The government fixed wages, it fixed prices, it even fixed rents for both businesses and individual civilians. And industry in general shifted from consumer production to war production. There was also a move at this time from class taxation to mass taxation, and the government began garnishing income taxes from Americans' paychecks. It is important to note that nothing that FDR did with his New Deal programs actually ended the Great Depression. It was the war production that was ramped up at the beginning of World War II that actually ended the Great Depression in the United States. There were new incentives for businesses to increase output, included low interest rate loans and guaranteed profits. And this period was marked by innovation in manufacturing and government-sponsored scientific research. The West Coast and the American South emerged as a focus of military industrial production as the government opened up military bases across both regions. This map here illustrates the spread of domestic military bases during World War II. And you can see the concentration of those was primarily in the South and in the West, including right here in North Carolina. The military bases like Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune were established at this time. And the establishment of these military bases greatly enhanced the economies of the regions in which they were established, very much assisting the country to rise out of the Depression. Labor entered into a three-sided agreement during World War II with business and government that led to unprecedented numbers of unionized workers in exchange for industrial peace and stable war production. The government also set a very low level of taxes on corporate profits, incentivizing these corporations to ramp up war production. However, despite this agreement, the years 1943 and 1944 in particular witnessed numerous walkouts despite this no-strike pledge, illustrating that all was still not completely well between labor and business in this period. World War II came to be collectively remembered in the American conscience as the Good War and is filled with national unity and noble goals. This was one of the few wars in history where it seemed very clear who the good guys and the bad guys were, especially as some of the more atrocious acts of the Nazi regime in Germany were becoming unveiled towards the end of the war. Patriotic public opinion was mobilized by advertising this new idea of the four freedoms, which was the government's rhetoric on why the United States was engaging in this war to start with, to help spread these freedoms around the globe. The freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those last two being completely new ideas at this time that would have significant impacts as we move forward. First Amendment protections in particular became central to Americans' definition of liberty in this period. This idea of freedom from want in particular was quickly embraced by more radical and liberal-minded Americans as one of the fundamental freedoms that Americans should enjoy. And this idea evolved into an understanding that this guaranteed a protection of the future living standard of ordinary Americans. However, the poet Carlos Bulasan and others like him explain that for marginalized people, especially ethnic and racial minorities, freedom meant having access to food and education and sharing in the promise and fruits of American life. And those people quickly translated this idea of freedom from want, which was something that was advertised as something that the United States was fighting for abroad, still needed to be applied fully across the board for American citizens here at home. The Office of War Information was another government agency that was established during World War II, and this was the official propaganda bureau of the U.S. government that was established to mobilize public opinion for the war effort. In general, the Office of War Information sought to make the conflict a people's war, to protect average, everyday people from oppression from tyrannical and authoritarian regimes around the world. However, the Office of War Information faced the elimination of its funding by Congress after it appeared the office was devoting as much time to promoting New Deal social programs as the war effort itself. Besides government agencies like the Office of War Information, private companies also joined in on the wartime propaganda effort and promoted American patriotism. Many of these private companies' advertisements argued that there was a fifth freedom involved, and this was free enterprise. Businesses predicted that the post-war world would be filled with consumer goods and abundant possibilities if private enterprise were free of government control. Much like during World War I, during World War II, there was a mobilization of woman power to fill vacant industrial jobs left by men who had gone to fight in the war itself. In general, in this period, there was a glorification of the working woman in popular culture and by government propaganda by the Office of Wartime Information. Most notably, the idea of Rosie the Riveter, which you see right here, became the mascot of the working woman during World War II. And many women hoped to remain in the labor force once the war ended. However, despite this, there was still a very strong conservative pull of tradition regarding gender roles in this period, and women's work was presented as a temporary necessity, not as an expansion of women's freedom. And most female workers lost their jobs after the war, and the men returned and were able to take on those jobs once again. War propaganda in general promoted the American way of life as centered on a family with a wife at home using household appliances and consumer goods. That concludes part 2 of our chapter 22 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.